The Code of Maryland Regulations, known as COMAR, governs the implementation of restraints and seclusions in schools. The Maryland State Department of Education, MSDE, is responsible for ensuring schools and school systems adhere to COMAR. This presentation will provide an overview of existing regulations, policies, and procedures, and an update regarding recent legislation and new regulations related to restraint and seclusion. After completion of this training, participants will be able to demonstrate a comprehensive understanding of updated state and local regulations regarding physical restraint and seclusion, including House Bill 1255, and demonstrate an understanding of the appropriate use of physical restraint. House Bill 1255 went into effect on July 1, 2022. The bill addresses both physical restraint and seclusion in public and non-public schools, making changes to some COMAR regulations. For the purposes of this presentation, we will focus on how House Bill 1255 and COMAR impact public schools. Current regulations regarding physical restraint and seclusion will be shared. House Bill 1255 revises the definition of seclusion, bans the use of seclusion completely in public schools, and increases monitoring of physical restraint. Each of these will be discussed along with sections of the law that remain unchanged and in effect. House Bill 1255 broadened the definition of seclusion. Previously, seclusion was defined as the involuntary confinement of a student alone in a room or area from which the student is physically prevented from leaving. House Bill 1255 went into effect on July 1, 2022, and revised the definition of seclusion. Seclusion is currently defined as confinement of a student alone in a room, an enclosure, or any other space from which the student is physically prevented from leaving. Implementing seclusion in public schools became illegal on July 1, 2022. It is critical that all staff know and understand the updated definition of seclusion so they do not unintentionally violate the updated regulations. It is also important to know what is not seclusion. Seclusion does not include a timeout. A timeout is a behavior management technique that removes the student temporarily from an activity or reinforcing situation, but not from the room or area of activity. Timeout is meant to provide the student with the opportunity to calm and refocus. The procedures for timeout should be specifically outlined in a classroom behavior management plan or a student's behavior intervention plan known as BIP. The plan for timeout should include what behaviors result in a timeout, where in the classroom the timeout will be completed, the length of the timeout, and how the student will be reintegrated back into instruction. Timeouts are a reactive intervention and should only be used in conjunction with proactive strategies and reinforcement for the demonstration of positive behaviors. Many schools utilize conscious discipline. It is important to note that use of the safe space is a proactive strategy and is not a timeout as long as the student is not physically kept in the safe space by staff or physically prevented from leaving it. Seclusion and exclusion are different. Exclusion is the removal of a student to a supervised area for a limited time period during which the student has an opportunity to regain self-control and is not receiving instruction, including special education, related services, or support. Common examples of exclusion in schools include assigning a student to take a supervised break in the hallway, referring the student to the support room or the SEL teacher's office, or referring the student to the office for a disciplinary referral. These are examples of exclusion, not seclusion. As a reminder, seclusion as defined cannot be implemented in any BCPS school. We will now discuss the appropriate use of physical restraint and seclusion per state law and BCPS policy. Physical restraint refers to a procedure that immobilizes a student or reduces the ability of a student to move the student's torso, arms, legs, or head freely during school hours. Physical restraint does not include briefly holding a student to calm or comfort the student, holding a student's hand or arm to escort the student safely from one area to another, moving a disruptive student who is unwilling to leave the area if other methods such as counseling have been unsuccessful, or breaking up a fight in the school building or on school grounds. Restraints can only be implemented in an emergency situation to protect a student or other person from imminent, serious physical harm after other less intrusive, non-physical interventions have failed or been demonstrated to be inappropriate for the student. You have heard the language imminent serious physical harm. Comar aligns the definition of imminent serious physical harm to have the same meaning as serious bodily injury as used in Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Bodily injury involves a substantial risk of death, extreme physical pain, protracted and obvious disfigurement or protracted loss or impairment of the function of a bodily member, organ, or mental faculty. It would be inappropriate to implement restraint in response to behaviors such as disrespect, noncompliance, insubordination, or out-of-seat behavior or any minor infraction. Comar legislation requires each year the school administrator must authorize school personnel to serve as a school-wide resource to assist in ensuring the proper administration of exclusion and physical restraint, and school personnel to use physical restraint and to implement the policies and procedures for physical restraint. The monitoring staff and restraint intervention staff must receive the required training if they are not the same individuals. These staff are required to engage in the following annual professional development: positive behavioral interventions, strategies and supports, including methods for identifying and diffusing potentially dangerous behavior, trauma-informed interventions, functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention planning, symptoms of physical distress and positional asphyxia, first aid and cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, and individualized behavior interventions based on student characteristics, including disability, medical history, and past trauma. This mandated professional learning is addressed via a Schoology course, as well as participation in a BCPS-approved crisis management system, such as CPI or PCM. School administrators will select annually those required to complete these requirements. October 30th, 2021, MSDE published a press release stating MSDE will be reviewing its regulations, policies, and monitoring process to ensure that no local school system illegally restrains or secludes any student. MSDE has developed an action plan to provide increased oversight and corrective measures in each school system and will be intervening if necessary. In addition, MSDE is collaborating with the state's Office of Inspector General for Education to ensure complaints involving civil rights are addressed. MSDE is urging students and families concerned about the use of restraint and seclusion to reach out to their local boards of education and MSDE for support. Parents of students with disabilities who believe that their student has been illegally restrained or secluded are being encouraged to file a formal state special education complaint with MSDE. Physical restraint is prohibited in schools unless there's an emergency situation and physical restraint is necessary to protect a student or another individual from imminent serious physical harm after other less intrusive non-physical interventions have failed or been demonstrated to be inappropriate for the student. Physical restraint can only be implemented by staff members who have completed the annual required trainings. While physical restraint is allowed in limited circumstances, it is a crisis-oriented response that should not be used in lieu of less intrusive non-physical interventions. Under no circumstances should physical restraint be used for the purpose of coercion, discipline, staff convenience, or retaliation. Regardless of whether it is included in a student's BIP and IEP, physical restraint may not be used as a planned behavior intervention in response to behavior that does not pose imminent danger of serious physical harm to self or others. It would also be inappropriate to use physical restraint as a form of punishment or discipline in response to disrespect, noncompliance, insubordination, or out-of-seat behavior. Each school year, staff who are identified by the principal to implement restraint in an emergency situation must complete training that is mandated by COMAR. The Schoology course and successful completion of a BCPS-approved crisis management system, such as CPI or PCM, must be completed in their entirety each school year prior to implementing restraint. COMAR indicates that in applying physical restraint, school personnel shall only use reasonable force as is necessary to protect a student or other person from imminent serious physical harm. In addition, physical restraint must be discontinued as soon as the student is calm. Staff implementing restraint shall provide a student who is restrained with an explanation of the behavior that resulted in the restraint after each restraint incident. An administrator must be notified that a restraint was implemented as soon as possible. Restraint may not exceed 30 minutes. Staff implementing restraint may not place a student in a face-down position or any other position that will obstruct a student's airway or otherwise impair a student's ability to breathe, obstruct a staff member's view of the student's face, or restrict a student's ability to communicate distress. Staff implementing restraint may not place pressure on a student's head, neck, or torso, or straddle a student's torso. After restraint is implemented, the student must be seen by the nurse to ensure the student's well-being. The nurse must document the examination and any findings and/or treatment provided. Each restraint incident must be debriefed and documented by the staff involved. Restraint must be documented in SPS using the restraint documentation form. Each time a restraint is implemented, the student's parents must be provided oral and written notification within 24 hours, unless otherwise provided for in the student's BIP or IEP. Following an incident involving restraint, the administrator notified of the intervention should meet with all school personnel involved in the incident to discuss the following: events preceding, during, and following the use of physical restraint, how to prevent the need for physical restraint, including the factors that may have contributed to the escalation of behaviors, alternatives to physical restraint, such as de-escalation techniques and possible interventions, other strategies that the school principal or designee determines are appropriate. Administrators are strongly encouraged to document the content of the meeting, who participated, and any changes made as a result. If changes are needed to the IEP and BIP in order to reduce the need for restraints, a team meeting must be scheduled, the proposed changes and rationale discussed, and agreed upon changes made and documented in the PWN. MSDE will be monitoring debriefing closely when conducting LSS audits. House Bill 1255 introduces a new requirement for reporting physical restraints. If a student is physically restrained 10 times or more in a school year, MSDE must be notified at the earliest opportunity, but not longer than 4 business days after the student's 10th incident of physical restraint. Once notified, MSDE will review the student's case, including the circumstances of each incident of physical restraint, and assess the pattern of behavioral health interventions to evaluate whether less restrictive behavioral health interventions could be used. MSDE will develop and share recommendations. In addition, BCPS will be required to submit a systematic evidence-based corrective action plan to MSDE if a student has been physically restrained 10 or more times in a school year. MSDE collects annual data from local school systems and public agencies on the use of restraint incidents, disaggregated by student data, i.e., gender, grade, disability, age, and type of placement. Annual data are also collected on professional development provided to staff, i.e., trauma-informed interventions, and positive behavioral interventions, strategies, and supports. MSDE may monitor and request any information regarding any matter related to exclusion or restraint implemented. In order to ensure compliant and legal use of restraint and seclusion, BCPS will increase monitoring of the implementation and documentation of these interventions. After restraint is implemented, it is important the Student Support Team, or SST, or IEP team meets to discuss the incident and determine what changes, if any, are indicated. In most cases, follow-up either in SST for students who do not have IEPs or in the IEP team meeting is required after restraint and/or seclusion are implemented. The IEP team must obtain the written consent annually of the parent if the team proposes to include physical restraint in the BIP and IEP to address the student's behavior. The parent must complete and sign the parental consent Appendix C document found in SPS specific to including restraint in the BIP and IEP each year. If the parent has not provided consent during the last calendar year, restraint may still be implemented in an emergency when necessary to protect a student or another individual from imminent serious physical harm after other less intrusive non-physical interventions have failed or been demonstrated to be inappropriate for the student. If the parent has not provided written consent in the last calendar year and restraint is implemented, the parent must be notified of the implementation of restraint, and the team must follow COMAR requirements to meet within 10 business days of the incident. If restraint is implemented with a student who has not been identified as a student with a disability, the student must immediately be referred to the school's SST or an IEP team. If restraint is used for a student with a disability and the BIP and IEP do not include the use of restraint, the IEP team must meet in accordance with COMAR 13A.08.03 within 10 business days of the incident to consider the need for a functional behavioral assessment, developing appropriate behavioral interventions, and implementing or revising a BIP. If restraint is used for a student with disability and the BIP and IEP include the use of restraint, the student's BIP and IEP must specify how often the IEP team must meet to review or revise, as appropriate, the student's BIP and IEP. Team chairs must follow all COMAR regulations regarding inclusion of restraint in the BIP and IEP. Once physical restraint has been used or school personnel have made a student-specific determination that it may need to be used through intentional conversation and discussion in the IEP process and development of the IEP, physical restraints may be included on a student's BIP and IEP to address the student's behavior in an emergency, provided that school personnel review available data to identify any contraindications to the use of physical restraint based on medical history or past trauma, including consultation with medical or mental health professionals as appropriate. Identify the less intrusive non-physical interventions that will be used to respond to the student's behavior prior to the use of physical restraint in an emergency situation, and obtain written consent from the parent. As a reminder, Restraint may not be used as a planned behavioral intervention in response to a behavior that does not pose imminent danger of serious physical harm to self or others, even when included in the IEP and BIP. It may only be implemented in an emergency situation to protect a student or other person from imminent serious physical harm after other, less intrusive, non physical interventions have failed or been demonstrated to be inappropriate for the student. As previously stated, when physical restraint is included in the BIP and IEP, the BIP and IEP must specify how often the IEP team must meet to review or revise the BIP and IEP. When an IEP team meets to review or revise a student's BIP and IEP, the IEP team must consider existing health, physical, psychological, and psychosocial information, including any contraindications to the use of restraint based on medical history or past trauma. Information provided by the parent. Observations by teachers and related service providers. The student's current placement and the frequency and duration of restraint events that occurred since the IEP team last met. Revisions made to the IEP or BIP must be documented. These changes must be shared with all school staff working with that student following the meeting. Thank you for your attention during this presentation. The work you do to maintain a safe and supportive learning environment compliant with COMAR requirements is greatly appreciated.